Camilla secretly tried to claim Queen Elizabeth II's estate for her own family, but King Charles found out. With support from Princess Anne and damning royal files, Charles banished Camilla from the palace and stripped her of power. Welcome viewers to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The world stopped for a moment on September 8, 2022. The news of Queen Elizabeth II's passing was more than just the end of a long and storied reign. It was the closing of an entire chapter of history. For 70 years, she had been a constant, a symbol of stability in an ever-changing world. Her death was met with an outpouring of grief that was global in scale, a collective ache for a woman many had never met but felt they knew intimately. In the United Kingdom, the mourning was palpable. Crowds gathered, flowers were laid, and a profound sense of loss settled over the nation. In the midst of this sorrow, a new era began. The transition of power to King Charles III was swift and, by all public accounts, seamless. The world watched as he stepped into the role he had been preparing for his entire life, a man finally fulfilling his destiny. His first address to the nation was a masterclass in poise and empathy, a promise to uphold his mother's legacy of service. The public, for the most part, was moved. They saw a man who had waited patiently, who had endured public scrutiny and personal hardship, finally taking his rightful place. And at his side was Queen Camilla. The transformation of her public image had been a long, deliberate process. For decades, she was the other woman, the one blamed for the collapse of a fairytale marriage. She was the one the public loved to hate. But over time, through a quiet, steadfast presence and a dedicated public relations effort, she had slowly but surely won over a skeptical nation. She had become an accepted part of the royal family, a supportive partner to Charles, and finally, a queen consort. The Queen herself had endorsed the title in her final Platinum Jubilee address, a powerful sign of acceptance and a clearing of the path. But even as the world watched the public spectacle of mourning and succession, something was happening behind the scenes. While the cameras focused on the solemn faces and the formal processions, a different kind of war was being fought in the quiet corridors of power. The accession of a new monarch isn't just a ceremonial event, it's a logistical and legal one. It triggers a cascade of changes, not least of which is the transfer of the late monarch's immense personal wealth and assets. It's crucial to understand the distinction here. The Crown Estate, a vast portfolio of properties and holdings, is not the monarch's private property. It's a public entity managed on behalf of the Crown. But Queen Elizabeth II also possessed an enormous private estate, including treasured homes like Sandringham and Balmoral, a priceless art collection, rare stamp collections, personal investments, and countless other assets accumulated over a lifetime. This was her personal legacy, meant to be passed down through the family, and it was here, in the management and distribution of this private wealth, that a quiet and insidious plan allegedly began to unfold. According to later revelations, Camilla's ambition was not satiated by the title of Queen Consort. Her decades-long journey to the top had given her a seat at the most exclusive table in the world, but it seems she wanted more. She allegedly wanted to secure a lasting financial legacy for her own family, her children, Tom and Laura, a legacy that would be separate from the royal line. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about using her new position to ensure her bloodline had a permanent, financial foothold within the royal establishment. The plan was said to be meticulous, subtle, and designed to avoid detection. It began not with grand gestures, but with the quiet manipulation of legal documents and the strategic placement of trusted allies within the complex web of executors and advisors. These were quiet conversations, legal filings buried in mountains of paperwork, and slight adjustments to the language of official documents. It was a game of inches, where every small move was a calculated step towards a much larger goal. While the world was consumed with the pomp and circumstance of the state funeral, with the solemnity of the vigils, and with the details of King Charles's first weeks on the throne, the gears of this scheme were already turning. The palace was a hive of activity, but it was a distracted hive, focused on the public-facing duties of the new reign. This provided the perfect cover for actions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. A question must be asked here: why would someone who had achieved everything she had ever publicly wanted risk it all? What would drive a person to take such a monumental gamble, to betray the trust of the man she had loved and supported for so long? Was it a desire for security, a fear that her elevated status was still tenuous. Was it a long-held ambition finally given the opportunity to flourish? Or was it something else entirely, a deeply personal and emotional drive to ensure her children were not left out in the cold, a feeling that had its roots in the long, difficult years before she was accepted by the family? The answer is likely a complex mix of all these things, but it was a decision that set in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring the monarchy to the brink of a private crisis. The scene we are painting is one of a perfect storm, the profound distraction of a nation in mourning, the logistical chaos of a new reign, and a well-placed, highly ambitious individual with a plan to leverage her new power for personal gain. The public saw a new king and his queen, a symbol of continuity and stability. But in the quiet rooms of the palace, a different story was just beginning. It was a story of a silent takeover, a secret that would remain hidden until the moment a single, unassuming manila folder landed on the wrong desk, and an unlikely pair of siblings started to connect the dots. To understand the full scope of what allegedly transpired, one must first grasp the vast, intricate, and often misunderstood nature of royal finances. The average person imagines the monarch has a single, immense fortune at their disposal. The truth is far more complex. The Crown Estate, as we've established, is a public corporation, a vast portfolio of land and property owned by the monarch, in right of the Crown. Its profits, which amount to hundreds of millions of pounds a year, go to the treasury, and in return, the monarch receives the sovereign grant to fund their official duties. This is public money, not personal wealth. But then, there is the Queen's private estate. This is a separate universe of assets, built and curated over a lifetime. It included not just the sentimental, but also the immensely valuable. At its heart were the beloved private homes of Sandringham House in Norfolk and Balmoral Castle in Scotland. These were not state-owned properties like Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, they were Elizabeth's personal residences, her true sanctuaries. In addition to these were a staggering collection of rare stamps, fine art, jewels, antique furniture, and a significant portfolio of private investments. These were the true heirlooms of the House of Windsor, passed down from monarch to monarch, often with specific personal instructions. It was this private estate that became the object of alleged desire. The reports, pieced together from later disclosures, suggest that Camilla, now queen consort, began a series of quiet, deliberate maneuvers to divert a significant portion of this wealth. Her plan, as it was later revealed, was not to steal outright, but to subtly and legally redesignate certain assets. The target was to ensure that a substantial portion of this wealth, particularly certain prized properties or valuable holdings, would be left not to the direct line of succession, William and his children, but to her own bloodline, her son Tom Parker Bowles and her daughter Laura Lopez. The alleged scheme was as audacious as it was simple in its execution. The transfer of the Queen's private assets was a massive administrative undertaking, involving layers of lawyers, accountants, and executors. In the whirlwind of the succession, with new titles being conferred and new roles being defined, it was easy for certain details to slip through the cracks. Camilla, with her new authority and proximity to the king, was in a unique position to influence these proceedings. The plan was said to involve the quiet insertion of new legal clauses, the redrafting of specific trust documents, and the subtle coercion of legal staff who were overwhelmed and preoccupied with the magnitude of their task. For example, sources suggest that there was an attempt to reclassify certain items within the royal art collection, designating some of the most valuable pieces as personal gifts from the late Queen to Camilla, a designation that would give her control to pass them on to her own children. There were also whispered accounts of an effort to have parts of the Balmoral estate, which was so dear to Queen Elizabeth, discreetly placed in a private trust for Camilla's family. The narrative of this action would have been framed as an expression of the Queen's personal affection for Camilla, a final act of private generosity. This was not a smash and grab. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of an inheritance, veiled in the chaos of a national transition. The alleged motive wasn't just greed, it was about legacy. For Camilla, securing a lasting financial and social position for her family was the final piece of the puzzle. She had achieved her title, but without a concrete legacy for her children, she was still, in some ways, an outsider. By ensuring they had a permanent, inherited stake in the royal world, she would cement her own place in history in a way no title ever could. The psychological dimension of this alleged plot is fascinating. Imagine the state of mind of a woman who had spent a lifetime in the public eye, often as a lightning rod for criticism. She had finally achieved acceptance, even admiration, but perhaps a part of her still felt vulnerable, still felt the need to build her own defenses. The public facade of unity and grief masked a private world of immense pressure and personal ambition. Camilla's alleged plan, if true, was a high-stakes move, a final gamble to ensure her family was not just a footnote in the royal story, but a permanent chapter. The plan's weakness lay in its sheer complexity. It required the cooperation or ignorance of multiple people, from low-level accountants to high-ranking legal advisors. It relied on the chaos of the transition to obscure its true nature. The mastermind, if you can call it that, believed that no one would be paying close enough attention, that the grief and pomp of the moment would be the perfect smokescreen. But as we will see, a small, seemingly insignificant detail would unravel the entire conspiracy. The silent ticking of the grandfather clock in the palace halls was not just counting down to a public event, it was counting down to the moment a single, courageous employee would refuse to sign off on a transaction that simply felt wrong. The deception was brilliant in its conception but fragile in its execution, and its exposure was not a matter of if, but of when. In the intricate, bureaucratic machinery of Buckingham Palace, every cog must turn in perfect synchrony. The palace's financial department is a world of its own, a silent, meticulous operation handling everything from the sovereign grant to the monarch's personal accounts. It was here, in this universe of ledgers and spreadsheets, that the first tremors of unease were felt. The accountant, Alistair, a man of quiet competence and a stickler for protocol, was the one who noticed them. His job was to ensure every transaction, every transfer, was accounted for and properly authorized. He was a man who lived by the rulebook, and the numbers he was seeing were not following the rules. The initial anomaly was small, almost insignificant. A minor trust fund, designated for the maintenance of a specific wing of a lesser-known royal property, had its beneficiaries quietly altered. The change was legally filed and seemed legitimate on the surface, but Alistair's instincts, honed over 30 years of service, told him something was off. The change was made with a new legal firm, one that had been brought into the royal fold only recently, and the paperwork lacked the usual meticulous layers of authorization from the late Queen's personal solicitors. It was a red flag, but a very subtle one. He marked it, but didn't act, assuming it was a mistake that would soon be corrected. Then came another. A valuable piece of art, a painting from the royal collection that had been on loan to a national gallery, was quietly recatalogued as a personal gift from the Queen to one of Camilla's relatives. This was a more serious breach of protocol. The royal collection is held in trust for the nation. While individual monarchs can and do make gifts, the reclassification of a public asset as a personal one is a monumental and rarely taken step. The paperwork had a signature that looked authentic, but again, the legal process seemed rushed and unconventional. Alistair found himself scrutinizing the dates, the wording, and the legal footnotes, a feeling of creeping dread slowly settling over him. He began to track the financial movements more closely, cross-referencing every transaction related to the Queen's private estate. What he uncovered was a pattern, a slow, steady stream of redesignations and reallocations of assets, each one seemingly minor on its own, but cumulatively representing a significant portion of the Queen's private wealth. It was like watching water drain from a bathtub one drip at a time. No single drip was alarming, but the cumulative loss was becoming impossible to ignore. The beneficiaries of these assets were consistently Camilla's family, her children, her grandchildren, and even her sister. Alistair knew he was in a dangerous position. He was just an accountant. Going public would be career suicide and could lead to a massive scandal that would shake the monarchy to its core. He had a duty to his employer, but he also had a duty to the truth. He was caught in a moral dilemma. Should he raise the alarm and risk being dismissed as a paranoid crank, or should he remain silent and be complicit in a potential crime? He decided he couldn't keep it to himself. But who could he trust? King Charles was grieving, and the palace was a snake pit of courtiers and aides, many of whom were new and might have allegiances to the new queen. He needed someone who was utterly beyond reproach, someone whose loyalty to the crown was absolute. There was only one person who fit the description. He found an opportunity to approach a trusted, long-serving aide of Princess Anne. Alistair didn't go into detail, but he expressed his deep concern over irregularities in the handling of the late Queen's private estate and hinted that something was very wrong. The aide, a man who had worked with Anne for decades, recognized the gravity in Alistair's voice. He promised to pass the information on. The whispers, however, were initially dismissed. They were considered the kind of paranoid gossip that swirls around any royal succession. People are always looking for drama, for a story to tell. But the Princess Royal was different. Her reputation was not built on rumor, but on practicality and a no-nonsense approach to her duties. She took the vague warning and, in her own methodical way, began to investigate. She didn't confront anyone, she simply started asking subtle questions, requesting copies of legal documents, and observing the new movements of staff and advisors with a keen, almost surgical eye. The initial tremors Alistair had felt were now reaching a new, more powerful level, poised to shake the foundations of the palace to their very core. Princess Anne is an anomaly in the royal family. While her brother Charles is known for his sensitivity and a lifelong search for purpose, Anne is defined by her unflinching pragmatism and an almost military-like devotion to duty. She is often called the hardest-working royal, not for glory or public adoration, but because she believes it is simply her job. Her relationship with her brother, the king, is unique. They are just 2 years apart and shared a childhood that was often solitary, with their parents, the Queen and Prince Philip, traveling extensively. This forged a bond that was both deeply affectionate and built on a foundation of mutual respect and brutal honesty. She is one of the few people in the world who can speak to the king without filters, to tell him what he needs to hear, not just what he wants to hear. When the warning from Alistair's aide reached her, Anne didn't dismiss it as palace gossip. Her mind, sharp and analytical, immediately connected the dots. She had also noticed the new legal firm. She had seen Camilla's children present at meetings they would not normally attend. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of observing the subtle power dynamics within the family, screamed that something was wrong. Her private motto, one she lived by, was, if it doesn't add up, it probably doesn't. And right now, nothing was adding up. She knew she couldn't approach Charles with a vague accusation. He was still in the raw, fragile state of grief, and any suggestion of betrayal from his new queen would be met with disbelief and fierce denial. He had spent decades fighting for the right to be with Camilla, and his belief in her was a cornerstone of his identity. She had to approach him not as a sister with a suspicion, but as an ally with a problem. The setting of their secret meeting was significant. Anne chose a quiet, non-official residence, a small cottage on the Balmoral estate. It was a place of privacy, a place where they could be just Charles and Anne, not King and Princess Royal. The meeting took place late one evening, under the cloak of darkness. When Charles arrived, he was weary, burdened by the immense weight of his new role. He expected a discussion about protocol, a briefing on an upcoming public engagement. He was not prepared for what Anne was about to tell him. Anne began not with a direct accusation, but with a series of questions. "Are you aware," she asked, "of the full details of the legal team handling Mother's private estate?" She then presented him with a list of the new legal firms and the specific anomalies Alistair had uncovered. She showed him the paperwork for the reclassification of the art and the changes to the trusts. She did so calmly, dispassionately, as if presenting a business case. She used cold, hard facts, not emotion. Charles was initially resistant. He defended Camilla, attributing any changes to a necessary streamlining of a complex estate. He spoke of the Queen's deep affection for Camilla, suggesting that these might have been her private wishes. But Anne was relentless. "Charles," she said, her voice low and steady, "this is not about what we believe. It is about what the documents say. These actions are inconsistent with Mother's long-standing instructions. They are, in fact, a complete reversal of her stated intentions." She then presented him with the full, detailed dossier Alistair had compiled. It laid out the pattern of the financial transfers, the names of the new beneficiaries, and the paper trail that led directly to Camilla's inner circle. She had not come to him with a whisper, she had come with a smoking gun. The moment of truth arrived when Anne produced a copy of a legal instruction from a decade prior, signed by Queen Elizabeth, which explicitly outlined her desire to keep certain assets within the direct line of succession. This document was not public, it was a private instruction for the royal lawyers. It was the undeniable proof of a deception. Charles was shaken. The fatigue on his face was replaced by a look of dawning horror. He looked from the documents to his sister, his confidant. The truth was not just a fact, it was a devastating betrayal. It was the realization that the woman he had fought so hard to make his queen was, in her first days in that role, allegedly working against the very institution he was now sworn to protect. In that small room, the newly crowned King of England and his fiercely loyal sister forged a pact. It was a quiet, private alliance, a brotherhood and sisterhood against a common, internal enemy. The investigation would now escalate from the quiet work of an accountant to a full-scale royal inquiry, led by the two people who had the most to lose. The real work, the work of uncovering the full,